Welcome to Closing Time with jwest. I'm a real estate agent in St. Thomas and Elgin County, and today joining me is Andrew Lawton, our Member of Parliament for Elgin, St. Thomas and London South. Today we're going to talk about housing affordability, development, infrastructure, some of the challenges and opportunities facing our communities here in Elgin County and across Southwestern Ontario. Andrew, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on, Jeff.
Oh, I really appreciate it. And I'm sure you hear a lot about housing from the constituents in our area. And the biggest one, I think, right now for everybody is affordability. Continues to be one of the biggest concerns for all Canadians. What are you hearing most from residents locally?
I mean, you're right when you say affordability. And I think it's that there's often this dream of home ownership that people have always had, and it's dwindling more and more for people these days, especially young people. Like the number of young people I've heard from, and by young I mean under 40. I think young is getting younger. What constitutes young is getting older now. Saying that they don't think they're ever going to be able to buy a house and buy a home. And that to me is tragic. It's also something I've lived through. I mean, my wife and I, we bought our first house during COVID. We were both employed. We both had the relative stability at the time of jobs, and we were able to buy something when the market had just tanked. But the fact that we required something like that to be able to get into the housing market is, I think, itself a big problem. So it's young people that are writing off that dream of home ownership. You also get concerns from people on the other end of the age spectrum about home equity, and whatnot. So I think that we need to look at housing as being a major priority, not just for the federal government, but for all levels of government.
Yeah, right now, what I'm finding, I just met with this lovely couple that want to sell their house and downsize. And unfortunately, they bought during COVID and paid a lot of money for their house. A young couple, 5% down on their purchase price. And unfortunately, they don't have any equity in their home now because prices have dropped so much.
Yeah, and this is the problem. I mean, look, there's always going to be examples that you can point to of people that just got in at the worst time and got out at the worst time. Like that's always going to happen. And some people are, I think, over time doing much better because they've been in their house for 10, 15, 20 years. People are a lot more mobile now. This is something that we need to deal with. So if you have to sell your house within 3, 4, 5 years, you might not have had time if you bought in when things were at their peak. And I think that's the issue, is that we had a period in which it was impossible for people to get into the housing market here because you were competing against people who had sold $1 million+ homes or condos in the GTA coming down here because they're part of that class of people that's able to work remotely, which is fine. But we also have to look out for how people in our community are able to get in. And, even in communities that once would never have seen homes going for what they're going for now, like West Lorne and Rodney, like now you still have to shell out a huge amount of money. And we're seeing this gap in a lot of government programs and the real world experiences. And I'm not criticizing, because I think it's important that all levels of government are trying to do something. But some of the initiatives we have seen haven't really tackled the root of it, which is that a lot of young people, and a lot of people in general, can't afford a $600,000 home, a $700,000 home, which is increasingly, for a lot of what once was considered a starter home, where the prices are landing at. So this is something we need to be able to deal with. Supply is part of it, but also an economy in which people are able to build up their savings. People are able to get that down payment, which right now is just so out of reach for people. Like, you're having trouble filling up your gas tank and buying groceries. How are you ever going to sock away $50,000, $60,000 for a down payment if you wanted to do 10 down, which is now like never happening for first-time home buyers?
I agree. It is so difficult. And it's funny. People think that, because I'm a realtor, I like the price of housing. I have 5 kids under the age of 22 that are going to have to buy a property. And it's not easy, like working full time and putting every penny away. It's difficult when, you're spending $100 to fill up your car and and $200 for a small bag of groceries.
Yeah. And also, like, what we're seeing now, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this in a decade, 15, 20 years, when people are getting into the housing market later and later because that's the only chance they had to, that means they're carrying that mortgage into later and later periods in their life. So if you're 40 when you buy your house, you're not mortgage free until you're 65. And so you lose out on that other aspect, which is actually being able to have that freedom from having to have a mortgage payment, being able to own your house. So these are really, really significant things. It's also impacting the desire that a lot of families would have to pass on, equity to their children. That transfer of generational wealth is harder and harder to come by. So, we need to find ways to address this, to stimulate the housing market, to make it affordable for people to go into it. And that's, I think, where we really need an all hands on deck approach. And you're right. Like, as a realtor, on one hand, like, you could say, well, wow, it's great when, home values are expensive, but not if no one can buy them. And it's great for buying if they're cheap, but not for selling. So, like, we need to find a balance no matter where we're heading with this.
For sure. Yeah. Moving on to a balanced market would be good. Right now, what we're finding is the HST rebate on new builds at the beginning sounded like a great idea to stimulate getting some properties built. But unfortunately, what we have found in residential resale is that it has really cooled off the residential resale market because so many people now are going to new builds.
Yeah. And the one thing as well, if I recall correctly, I think it was last year, Ontario lost 10,000 construction jobs. So you had builders who, again, had a great, run for several years that were just having to slam the brakes because no one was building or no one was buying. You had, vacant new home inventory that just could not be moved. And even now, I think there's a bit of that. And now builders have just had to completely scale down. And one of the problems we're seeing is that you can't scale up quickly. You can't scale back up immediately. You want to know that there's going to be some stability moving forward. Look, my party's platform on this had always been to cut the HST on all new homes, and not just for first-time home buyers. So I'm glad to see what we're seeing from the federal and provincial governments on this to a certain degree. But you're right to point out that it hasn't had yet, and it is still new, the desired effect. And I think it goes back to the down payment issue, because an HST break on a new home is good. But for a lot of people, that's not enough to make a new home affordable, given all of the economic circumstances we're dealing with right now. The issue is not that they wanted a 13% reduction. So I think what we're going to see on this is it's going to help people who could already afford a house buy a more expensive house, but it's not going to help people who couldn't afford to buy a house for the first time. And that's that demographic that we really need to look out for. And I think a very similar thing happened a few years back when the government had the first-time homebuyer tax credit, where the government would pay for basically 5% of your down payment in exchange for, or 5% of the purchase price in exchange for some equity in your house. It didn't actually let people who wouldn't already have qualified buy homes. It just let them buy a home that might have been slightly out of reach for them. And I want to make sure any program is letting people get into the housing market, build up some equity if that's where they're trying to strive in life.
Yeah. The nice thing that we've got now in St. Thomas, which I had Mike Rogozinski on as my guest last week or 2 weeks ago, mortgage broker, and we talked about the new program in St. Thomas where the city is going to help provide first-time home buyers, people that are renting currently in St. Thomas, that can be pre-approved for a mortgage but don't have a down payment. They will lend them the 5% down on a purchase price up to a home of $500,000, which I think is fantastic. It's at least a way for these people who are working full-time jobs but don't have enough money in the bank to put away $25,000 to buy a home. It's going to give them that start. If they can be approved for a mortgage, it's great.
Yes, and the local leadership in St. Thomas on this file has been phenomenal. Whenever I'm talking to Mayor Joe Preston and others in the city, I point out that St. Thomas is great because it's small enough to get things done and big enough to get things done. You really have that ability where the city has enough size that it can do really good things, but it's still small enough that it's not all encumbered by bureaucracy, which is, I think, the problem when you get to larger cities. And I think that one point that I would stress there as well is that, most people want to own a home. There are some people that they're fine renting and that's the goal and they never want home ownership. But most people, if you talk to them, especially down in St. Thomas, Elgin, they want a home. They want a home to raise their family. They want a home to build up some wealth for themselves. And that's something that we really need to be facilitating as much as possible. And it's, you have builders that want to build. You have people that are prepared to, in some cases, deal with living in a place that maybe they never wanted to live in. And I think that's the great thing for St. Thomas, is that you get a lot of people that maybe they work in London, but they see building a family, building a life, getting into the housing market in St. Thomas and Southwold and, Bayham and Malahide. They see that as being more attainable. I mean, how much mileage have we gotten out of 25% more life over the years? But there is still, I don't know if the percentage is the same, but there is still a lot of truth to that you can get a lot more out here. And I think it's really great to welcome that in. People that, want to have the way of life that's offered by these communities, and then expand. They, contribute to the tax base. They do great things for our community and for our economy.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people coming, even just from London to St. Thomas. A lot of people coming to my open houses. I actually had one last weekend, and I had two families here back to back from Nova Scotia looking at moving to St. Thomas.
That's a wider net for real estate that I think most people look. But hey, bring it on! I love it.
Yeah.
Trade in the ocean for Lake Erie.
I know. Well, their family, right? Yeah. They moved there because it is more affordable, right? So a lot of people have moved out there, and like this couple that I met, they moved out there, kids were gone. Well, now their kids have grandkids. So now they want to be back and closer to the grandkids, so they're coming back.
Well, but this is the thing we have to keep in mind. I mean, you look at the cost of a house in, New Brunswick or Nova Scotia compared to what it is in Ontario. And we're not quite at British Columbia levels, and we can thank goodness for that. But, we're also increasingly not immune from the Torontofication of the housing market down in Southwestern Ontario. And I think, what constitutes Toronto has moved further and further down the 401 ever since COVID. And that's something that we're up against. And it's really hard for someone to compete. And that was, to go back to my own story, when my wife and I were first trying to buy a home, we were going in and we're like, this was the era where you couldn't dream of putting a condition on an offer, and you'd go in and, someone from Toronto would come in and go $30,000 over asking for it. So you needed to look at a house that was so far below your price range just to even be competitive. And that was so difficult for people.
It was an awful time. It was very difficult because you knew that buyers were putting themselves in uncomfortable situations, because if they wanted a house, you weren't putting in a home inspection condition. You got put into a different pile. So a lot of people taking risks, and I'm actually happy to see it back to more of a balanced, well, we're not quite at a balanced market yet. We're still at quite a buyer's market, but getting to be a little bit more balanced. So now we can make sure that buyers are protected.
Yeah. And I think that's key. And at the end of the day, we want people to be able to buy and sell homes. People have to go through life changes. People have to move around, and you never want the market to force someone into one end of a really bad transaction. But I also think in general, we need to think about long-term sustainability. And that's the one thing that I think I hope we can get to, is avoiding the quick fixes and actually looking at what will, in the long term, help people get into this space. And like you said, have that balance that we need.
For sure. And one of the big things is working together, right? Municipalities, developers, government. What are your thoughts on kind of working as a group?
Well, I think
and things that maybe you've seen.
We need to just constitutionally in Canada respect levels of. There are certain issues where, the federal government doesn't dare go because it's provincial, and the provincial government doesn't dare go because it's federal, and you get things that are delegated to municipalities, and we need to respect that. But I also don't think people should get too legalistic in their thinking on this, because for the average person, you just want the system to work. Yeah, you don't want to get into this realm where you call up your MP and they say, oh, well, talk to your MPP, that's not my problem. Or you talk to city councilor and they say, hey, go call your MP. And so we need to have a respect for boundaries, but we all need to work in the same direction. And we all need to understand that having families who are equipped and empowered to have homes, can afford homes, that benefits everyone. Because, a lot of people, just looking at, the demography of Canada, a lot of people are delaying having families, not for work reasons, but because economically they don't feel that they're in a place where they could have a family, where they could plant roots. You also have people who, as well, are paying money in rent that is going to enrich someone else when they could be paying a mortgage, which means down the road they don't have the economic base in their own lives to do certain things. So all of these things, if we get it right, will benefit society as a whole. And to that vein, we do need to have federal leadership, provincial leadership, and municipal leadership. And I think anytime we can have different levels of government working together, that's the best. I mean, I am very glad that I get to share a role, or not share a role, but share a riding with the provincial housing minister in Rob Flack. So it's great that, whenever we have things we're working on at the federal level, I know I can just go down the hall at the queso station and chat with Rob about, how these things will interact with what the province is doing. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Well, we're certainly blessed here. We've always had, I found, being a small community, like before you, Karen Vecchio was always available. She was always attending events.
Yep.
I see you out at everything every weekend, or seems like you're at
I was talking about housing with someone else the other day, and they said, "Do you even need a home because you're never in it?" And I said, "Well, there's some truth to that, but it's good to have a place to rest your head." But and even Joe, Joe knew the federal issue. Joe Preston in and out because he was the MP for 11 years, and now he's the mayor. Not for long, but the mayor bringing with him that federal experience and now the municipal leadership. And I think that's a phenomenal way of doing things.
Well, and the fact that, I just had Andrew Lawton on, was my guest last week from Central Elgin. And now I've got you, and I'm going to touch base with Joe and Tom and all the different municipalities in Elgin. And it's just great that you're willing to take the time to do this stuff, because if I was in the GTA, I think it'd be a little bit more difficult. It's nice. I like this small town feel for sure. What advice would you give to those first time home buyers who are feeling discouraged about entering the market?
It's really tough. And I think that, one of the things that I will point to is that you have to reevaluate what your non-negotiables are and your negotiables are. And I hate telling people that, because I'm not saying settle. I'm not saying do that, but I'm saying you sometimes have to think, hey, maybe I would be okay with a bit more of a commute than I had in mind. Maybe I would be okay looking in this community or versus that community. Maybe I really don't need the garage. Maybe I can deal with just shoveling the driveway. I think things like that. Because I do think it's important to get a foothold in. As I said, my wife and I'll use us as examples. We got into the housing market later than a lot of people I knew, earlier than a lot of people I know as well. But it's easy to look at that one friend that was able to buy the townhouse when he was 22 and then sell the townhouse and, when the market was great, and then buy another house. It's easy to look at those people and be jealous. But I also would say, don't be defeated. Don't look at around and say, well, just because they did it first, I'm so far behind. It doesn't matter. Just get in when you can. Do what's affordable for you. Take advantage of programs that are there. And that's my open invitation to anyone out there. Reach out to my office, and, we can't, wave the magic wand and solve all of these problems, but we can point you to things that are there that could help. Even if it's not a federal program, we can probably try to find the answer as best as possible or refer you somewhere else. But, your elected officials are there to serve you. And if you are running up against issue, share your story with us, because it's helpful to have that, so that when I go to Ottawa and we are trying to find solutions on this, I know the real people that are affected by this. And, that's, I think, a really important thing that I certainly take very seriously.
Yeah, and I talk to a lot of young people too, getting into the housing market, and I have that same conversation with them, the difference between a want and a need. I want them, they want to be in the housing market, so they're not giving their money to a landlord that is, and they have no equity at the end of the day when they're ready to move. And sometimes getting into the market means sacrificing for a couple of years, maybe not being in your ideal location, and building some equity up in your home and moving up as you go along.
Yeah, I'm not going to say I like paying my mortgage payment. I don't enjoy that day every month, but I love every year getting maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but or revisionist. I like getting the annual report that shows how much more of my house I own. It's like, I've added another closet, that I own that's ours, but but there's a pride in it. And there's a really, really deep pride in that. And I think that, one good thing as well, and this is not at all a partisan comment, but having younger people involved in politics is really valuable. And I don't even think I qualify as young anymore, but we have members of parliament from all parties who are in their 20s, and they're living this. They've seen this in their communities, some in large cities, some in smaller communities. And having those voices at the table is very important. Like just understanding that we need to look out for the next generation that's trying to build up these communities, but also the older one as well. Like I think there's this false perception that all people above a certain age have a house or have equity, and that isn't the case. And we need to, as a community, understand those challenges. If you don't have that home equity as your retirement plan, what your life looks like, and have answers to those. And I've talked to other people that, are in that quote unquote baby boomer demographic. They say, hey, not all boomers are sitting on these, $700,000 houses that they can sell and, just coast until the end of their life. So that's a key part of this conversation as well.
Yeah, and I was a teacher for 22 years before I started selling real estate, and I was just in elementary school, and I always wondered why we didn't talk a whole lot about financial education. Yeah. And I feel like that is something that's lacking for a younger generation. They're not getting that financial education in schools, and I wish it was something that was pushed a little bit harder. Did I lose you there,
and
Andrew?
I understand that since I left school, there has been a financial literacy push, but I think it needs to be so front and center. I mean, like at the end of the day, I've seen the meme going around every year of like, thank goodness I learned what a parallelogram is. That's been really helpful every parallelogram season. But you need to know some of that stuff, but like the practical financial tips are so key. And I still, like every day in our office, we get people asking questions about things that I'm like, man, that should be taught in schools. People would be on a much stronger footing if it were.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about growth in Southwestern Ontario, because we've seen some significant growth right now. What opportunities do you think this is going to create for our region specifically?
Well, look at everything through rose-colored glasses, because we've taken a walloping in the last couple of years with everything that's happened on the trade front with the U.S. The two sectors most affected by this trade war are manufacturing and agriculture. Look around Elgin County, manufacturing and agriculture. And so we need to find a way through that. I've talked with a lot of businesses all over the riding, and even the ones that are not directly impacted by either American tariffs or Canadian retaliatory tariffs. They are affected by the uncertainty, and they are affected by that climate. And you see the same in real estate, people not wanting to invest, not wanting to build if they don't know what the future is going to hold. So we need to absolutely secure a tariff-free trade deal with the U.S. Our farmers and our manufacturers need that, and we need to work towards that. And that is totally a Team Canada approach that we need all hands on deck on. We need to look for trading partners elsewhere, but we also need to acknowledge that we're never going to find 350 million people that we share a border with that we can buy and sell goods with as we have since we were founded as a country. But I also think that there is a great deal of pride in what I look around and just see the resilience of Elgin. I mean, you look at how this community has reinvented itself over the years and how it's withstood pretty big exits in the past. I mean, look at Talbotville Ford. There's a great example. But how people rally, we seek new investment, we seek new partners. And I think we need to do that. And growth has to be a part of that. Not growth for the sake of growth, but growth that comes along, attracting all the things we need to be a world-class city and a world-class region.
Yeah, the Amazon and PowerCo coming, and we're starting to certainly get those, which leads to my next topic of conversation is infrastructure. Pressure on roads and healthcare, schools. What do you see about how important long-term planning is as far as that kind of development going on?
Into thinking about only the good things of growth without putting in the work. They've seen this in Dutton Dunwich recently, where if you want to grow, you need wastewater treatment. No one, when they want to cut the ribbon I'm a member of Parliament. I love going around cutting ribbons. No one wants to cut a ribbon and then think about what's going to happen with the dirty discharge water of these new houses or this new factory. But you need to do that. You need to do the unsexy stuff if you want to be in a community that's growing. Roads and infrastructure are key. There's a project I'm working on right now, which I can't give you too much information because we're still finalizing it, but it's on rural cellular connectivity. And by rural, I don't even mean that rural. Even just today, I was in the east end of St. Thomas, close to the Comfort Inn, and I had no cellular service. And this is in the city. And how do you expect to have industry and growth if you don't have basic cellular connectivity in regions that should have it? So I'm working on something to try to identify and overcome some of the problematic spots, because there are a few really perennial dead zones that I think the telecom companies have shown a willingness to address. But, cellular infrastructure, road infrastructure, wastewater management, all of this is part and parcel of it. And again, and this is where you can't just look at one level of government having the monopoly, because you deal with overlapping jurisdictions on this. I was at the grand opening of the water tower, the new water tower in Elmer a couple of months ago. That was a project that had all levels of government there, but Elmer's growing and needs more water. So it's a no-brainer, and you can't have growth without being prepared to have the infrastructure support as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're seeing that now, right? The bypass between going from, say, I live in Talbotville. So every time I go into town now, they're just ripping up the bypass. Yeah. And so everybody's taking detours across the city. And you're right. It's not sexy, but it's a necessity. It's something that has to be done in order for the growth to happen. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the rental market and attainable housing. I get messages every day. I don't deal a lot with long-term rentals. I have a short-term rental in Port, so I don't deal a lot with that. I'm just too busy with residential real estate or like selling. What affordability has become a major issue in the rental market. Do you have any ideas, realistic solutions? How can we improve this?
Well, look, I think supply is a big part of it. Getting shovels in the ground quickly. One of the things, and this affects both rental housing as well as, owned housing, is the amount of money in each abode that is going towards fees and regulations and bureaucracy. I think some of the home builders have said for single family homes, they're in it for $80,000 to $100,000 before basically putting a single 2x4 down. That's just in bureaucracy and red tape and regulations and taxes and development charges, which is a whole other thing. I don't know the numbers on residential, but I know it's quite significant. I know a lot of people will say, hey, we need rental housing, but then you find a site for it and they say, oh, but not there. So I think that we do need to, I don't even like getting into the name calling on it, because we do need to protect the character of neighborhoods and communities. But we also need to accept that if we want people to have a place to live, we need to find places to build those. And right. So supply is key. And I also think we need to understand the affordability crisis when we're building. And I understand why someone might want to build this massive, palace that's going to cost, $35 bajillion a month, and it's luxury living. But you need to understand where people are at. And that's not a slight against any builders, but when you look at some of the rental prices now, even in West Lorne, there's a place where it's I think $2,200 a month for rent. And again, in West Lorne, that's not something that we would have ever expected even 10 years ago if we were having this conversation. So I think that we have to understand that homes that are affordable, housing that is affordable, not necessarily affordable housing as people understand it, it needs to be part of it. And we need to be building places that people can actually afford to live in.
Yeah, I think what I see is that the cost of housing is so high for an investor to purchase a home and have their bills covered. The rent has to be high. So it's almost like the houses that need to be rental properties are those $350,000, $400,000 homes, but they're far and few between. There's just not a lot of them to make it affordable for these people to rent. Yeah. Because if a landlord's paying $4,000 a month on their mortgage payments, they can't rent it out for $2,500 a month.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this goes back to trying to eliminate the what I would say are unnecessary costs that are put onto builders, then put onto landlords, and then put onto tenants, and you're really pulling all the levers we have available to reduce that. Because if we can, again, get money that's just going to fuel government and not actually to build things, to not have to be shelled out. Development charges, again, I know it's not a federal issue predominantly, but I know that there has been recent work on this. Development charges we've seen in some communities really just be a revenue tool for municipal governments, and not actually what they're supposed to be, which is to ensure that you can get sewer service and power and all of these other things to a site. So I think we need to be very critical, very diligent in just making sure we're not just heaping unnecessary costs on builders, which are going to get passed along to tenants.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. And now, How optimistic are you about the future of communities like ours, St. Thomas and Elgin County?
Look, I remain an optimist, and I think that like the community is going to have a bright future for one predominant reason, which is the people in it. I mean, I look at how our business community supports each other. We're a member of my office of the Chamber of Commerce, and the one thing I love seeing is how competitors are more like colleagues here. You see local businesses that have the products of other local businesses on their shelves. People are using local roofing companies, local electrical companies, local flooring companies, and we see that as being a huge, huge boon. And I just love, love, love as part of my role, just being a champion of all the good things going on in the community. And I also think that, the things that we've talked about and, like the 25% more life, having a bit more land available here. These are things that make us attractive for investors. Now, there's an asterisk there. I think we need to be very, very careful whenever we're talking about, getting rid of farmland. Like no one's building new farms anymore. So we need to protect farmland. We need to protect the rural character of Elgin, but that doesn't mean not building where building makes sense. And I've talked about this with Dominique Giguère, the warden of Elgin County, but also the mayor of Malahide. Malahide has, great examples of communities like Lyons and Copenhagen, where they've built new homes, beautiful subdivisions. But Malahide has also really been very vigilant in protecting that character that makes Malahide what it is. And I think that's something we do very well, but we need to make sure we keep doing. And, we don't want to be the Joni Mitchell song, pave paradise and put up a parking lot. We want to have both. We want to, protect what we love about this region, but also ensure that we're keeping up with the potential and the progress.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's switch here a little bit and just talk a little bit more about kind of what surprised you the most about when you became an MP.
The funny example that I'll give is the bureaucracy of it. Like at the end of the day, when you're a member of parliament, you're working around halls of government, and in my office in Ottawa, it's mostly barren because I'm not allowed to hang anything on the wall myself. I have to request two government. I don't know why they send two people, but I have to request two people to come and hang a little picture up. And I asked one time why it was, and they said, well, it's because of the asbestos in the walls of our offices. But the building I'm in is a new building that doesn't have asbestos in it. But the policy is just this generic policy. So sometimes we separate the spirit of the rules from the letter of them. But on a serious note, I will say that the thing that I've loved is learning just so much about how things work, like learning about what this business does and how this product is made, and learning about some of these hidden gems that exist. And the surprise is just how, surprise is the bad word, because I knew how much great stuff there was here, but I'm always surprised by just how much more there is below the surface. Like you go to one restaurant and you love the restaurant, the owners, and you find out the owners also have this other service that they're providing. You go to this, down the street you've never been down before, and you see all of this just amazing new stuff there. And I think it's just about constantly being that champion of it. And that's just the most important role for me as the member of parliament. It's not what happens in Ottawa. I always say every time I get out of Ottawa and I'm back in the community, it's good to be around normal people, because that's to me the best part of the role.
What do you think is one thing people misunderstand about public service and community growth? You were talking a little bit about young people getting more involved. Is there any kind of tips that you would have for people that might be thinking about politics?
I'd say one thing is that it's not what you see on TV is just a small snippet of what the role is. And especially between parties, what people see on TV is the question period where there's, all the bickering and yelling back and forth. But there's actually a lot of collegiality as well. At the end of the day, we all want to serve Canadians. And when I have a challenging file from a constituent, I'm their member of parliament. And sometimes I go to the minister who sits across the aisle and we work on this together. And that's a very normal thing. When we're working on bills on committees, yes, sometimes it can be tense and there's a lot of disagreement, but there's a lot more collaboration than I think people realize. So I would say don't get scared off of it. There's public service without politics. Politics will play a role from time to time, but there are ways to serve your community and get involved that don't involve partisanship. And that's, I think, something that I would encourage anyone to do, regardless of which level of government, whether it's maybe you want to volunteer on a campaign. That's great. Or maybe you also want to join an advisory council for the city of St. Thomas. Like, all of them are places where people can give back.
Yeah. Well, we certainly appreciate your service to the members that you serve. We see you everywhere. So keep at it. And at the end of every podcast, I do a feature on a local small business. And this week, we're going to talk about the Premier Wine Bar at 168 Curtis Street in St. Thomas. I think you know the owner, Angela Player. She believes that every single one of her wines tells a story and every plate sparks a conversation. So if you are looking for a memorable night out, or you want to go to one of their events, listen to live music, or you want to even book a private party, you can give them a call, pop in and see her at 168 Curtis. I've actually ordered charcuterie boards from Angela a couple of times for my agent open houses, and they are spectacular.
I love it. So my wife and I actually went there for I think it was their 6th anniversary a few weeks back. And it was very memorable because that was like one of the days we were getting like 3 tornado warning alerts on our phone. So I'm like, well, if we're all going to get like, swept up in a tornado, at least we'll have some fine wine for the journey. So yeah, we were being told to like shelter in place and hide under tables. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll bring my glass with me if I need to.
Yes, absolutely. Why
yeah, they do great stuff. Yeah. And I think it's like I think I'm sorry, Angela, if I'm misquoting you, but I think she said like only a small fraction of their wines are even available commercially here. A lot of them are just like special things that she's curated from distributors and wineries overseas. So they have some really great stuff there. It's again, one of those hidden, I just not that hidden, it's, but you know what I mean? It's one of those gems just tucked away on the streets of St. Thomas.
It is. It's great. And the thing is I'm not a wine drinker. My wife is, but they had the day I went, they had a great imported draft beer from Germany. So they have beer too. So
there you go.
It's and the brewery's next door. Yeah. So there's lots of options. But thanks again, Andrew. I really do appreciate your time. And as I end my podcast every single week, let's get closing. Thanks so much.